So we've talked about ecological populations, and now we're going to talk about human populations, looking at age structure diagrams, total fertility rate, just human population dynamics in general, and then demographic transitions. So here we go. Here are your learning objectives and essential knowledge. As always, take a look at these, make sure you are understanding the bullet points, so that way you know you're going in the right direction. So age structure diagrams, also called population pyramids or histograms, whatever you want to call them, basically they're just a graphical depiction of the age makeup of a population. So what does my population look like? What's the breakdown by age, but also by sex? And so along the bottom is the population. And so on this particular graph, you can see that the units here are actually in percentages, but when you're reading one of these age structure diagrams, you actually have to be careful because it could be percentages, but it could also be total population, so actually by individuals. And then each bar is representing an age range. So you can see that the bottom bar is 0 to 4, the next one up is 5 to 9, and on it goes. And we look at these age structure diagrams in terms of reproduction. The reason why we look at age and reproductive status is because if you can reproduce, you're going to add to the population, or you have the ability to add to the population. And so in the pre-reproductive years, you have people that are not potentially not adding to the population by having offspring, whereas in your reproductive years, people are reproducing and thereby having children. And in the post-reproductive years, you have this more older population that is no longer having children. And so you can see that those people in the reproductive years is really important to take a look at, because this is how you know how fast your population is going to grow. These age structure pyramids are going to vary depending on what country you're looking at. So as you can see, in Mexico, it's very bottom heavy. So you have like a large proportion of people underneath the age of 15, right? In those pre-reproductive years, you have a very young population. Where in developed nations, such as Sweden, you have pretty even set of age groups. It's pretty stable until you get really to the top, where people obviously are ultimately going to die of old age. And, generally you have population age structure diagrams as these four. So you have these bottom heavy ones, like I was saying, right? They're rapidly expanding. So you have a very, very large young population. And then, more third world countries, developing nations, Guatemala, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia. The next pyramid would be expanding slowly. And actually, this is a little bit dated of a graph, but the United States is actually more in this stable zone right now, according to our increase according to birth rate. Maybe not in immigration, but just on birth rate and death rate alone, the United States actually belongs in this third category, where you have more of a stable, more stable diagram here. And basically everyone's kind of at the same, right? There's no like one age structure powering over another. And then in some declining countries, you end up with these elderly population at the top, and it's kind of almost like an inverted triangle, and you end up with a very small number of children at the bottom. So what do you think? Do you think that this population is increasing or decreasing? Very good. It is an increasing population, and actually it's a rapidly increasing population. And why do you think that's happening? Well, those younger people are ultimately going to have babies of their own, especially as death rates are falling in developing nations. Those people are from 0 to 4 are actually going to live into their reproductive years and going to end up having babies of their own. And so the American baby boom is actually an excellent case study to kind of take a look at how we can use these age structure diagrams and track a population of a country according to these age structure diagrams. And so baby boomers are these people who were born from 1946 to 1964. Basically, soldiers came back from war and people had babies and they moved to the suburbs, the American dream with the house and the white picket fence and the 2.5 kids or whatever, right? The American dream. And so there's this massive boom in children. And so you can see that we went way past 2.5 actually. Americans went even past 3.5. And so people had a lot of kids after the war. And so now this population of the people born during this time frame are actually our senior citizens now. And so we call this the graying of America. We have a very top-heavy age structure pyramid, and I kind of threw Social Security in there because, now they're all getting Social Security and there's not really any money to pay for that. But, that's economics or something. Anyway, moving on. So like I said, it's a really good case study. You can track where the baby boomers are in the population. So when they were born in 1955-ish, right, they're on that bottom part of the triangle, and then you have 1985. You can track them up. Now they're having less children, and so that pyramid is starting to come narrow back in, but you can see that boom as you track it up these age structure diagrams. So moving on, we're going to talk about total fertility rate, and also going to talk about human population dynamics. I threw these two together because I was having a hard time teasing them apart. So I'm just going to talk about both of them. So total fertility rate is the average number of children born to women in a population. And a fertility rate is the number of children born to a woman in her lifetime, so one woman. But the total fertility rate is the average number of children. So a replacement level fertility rate would be when a couple replaces themselves. So in developed countries, you have to take into account infant mortality rate and whatnot, but in developed countries, replacement level fertility would be 2.1 children per woman. That sounded weird. I'm sorry. Children per woman. And in developing countries, because there's more infant mortalities, couples need to have over 2.5 children per woman in order to reach replacement level. And if these countries do have replacement level fertility, then we can say that we've reached zero population growth, at least in terms of birth rates, right? And so we call that country stable. And so there are three things that really influence total fertility rate. We're going to go through each one. So social and economic status of women, cultural traditions, and family planning. Social and economic status of women is the single most important factor that affects fertility rates. So women that have lower status in their countries are going to have a very high fertility rate. Gender inequality is common worldwide. Women are considered less than in a lot of countries and cultures. Um, they have a lower social status, economic status. Um, they have less access to health care. They have no legal rights, not educated, not employed, not even earning anything. And so if you look at the graph here, right, this looks at illiteracy. And so men are much more educated than women, right? This is illiteracy. So women are much more illiterate than men. This is in 2002, but it still holds true today. So educational opportunities are also going to affect fertility. Um, Women with more education are going to marry later and have fewer children. They're going to be educated and want a career. And so if you look at this graph here, I think this is really telling is that, if you look at the level of education, the higher the level of education, the number of children you have tends to go down. Cultural traditions are also a big reason why there's a high fertility rate. In developing countries, women are usually younger. So the younger you are, the more likely you are to have more children. Also, depending on what your family does, let's say in more rural areas, the number of children will definitely be higher because there's a higher infant and child mortality rate. So your babies are less likely to live. And then also you need more children to help you run the family business, usually a farm, right? And then elder care. Here in the United States, we have facilities and, money set up that people can take care of our elders, whereas people in developing countries have a lot of children to make sure that someone's going to take care of them when they're older. And then, of course, religious values also come into play, whether it be, contraception or just having as many children as God allows. And so that will obviously affect the number of children that somebody has. So, like I said, contraception is also a very big part in family planning services. So, not just whether or not to use it, right? But also just the cultural aspect of who makes those decisions. So, if men are making those reproductive decisions and they don't want to use contraceptive, then that's what happens, right? But it's also just access to family planning. A lot of women don't have access to family planning. And so family planning services can offer lots of information about contraception and STDs, parenting, abortion. So all of these services can become available to women and thereby lowering the total fertility rate. And so in promoting family planning, there has actually been a 55% drop in total fertility rate. And so the money that's spent on family planning can actually save people in health and education costs. And so there are a lot of pregnancies in the world that are unplanned, and many couples don't have access to family planning. And so if you can invest in family planning and reproductive health, we can actually reduce total fertility rate quite a bit. So hopefully we've seen that empowering women can help slow population growth. Educating women helps them start their families later in life and having fewer children. Women having paying jobs will reduce the number of children that they have, and also giving them the ability to control their fertility, making the decision, do I want more babies? Because around the world, a lot of people don't have that kind of control. So moving on from birth rates into death rates, there are really two things that we really want to look at. One is infant mortality rate, being the number of live births that die within the first year. So for every 1,000 babies that are born alive, how many babies are dying within the first year. And then again, life expectancy. So, like I said, it's the number of infant deaths per 1,000 live births, and an infant being a baby that's 1 year old and younger. And this is affected by the mother's access to healthcare and nutrition while she's pregnant, and then also after the baby's born. With breastfeeding and infants being very vulnerable to disease, it's really important that mothers have access to both healthcare and nutrition during pregnancy and after. And so you can see that less developed countries have a much higher infant mortality rate than the more developed countries. And let's take a look at the US and infant mortality rates. The US isn't doing so great, actually. We're 55th in the world as of 2018 for infant mortality. So that meaning that there are 54 other countries in the world that are doing better than us. So on average, we have about 5.8 infant deaths per 1,000 births. And we can attribute this to inadequate health care for poor women during pregnancy, and for their infants when they're ultimately born. So just access to health care within the United States. There is also a high rate of drug addiction among pregnant women. And then also we have a high teen pregnancy rate that attributes to infant mortality, because teen pregnancies usually go longer without prenatal care. And moving into life expectancy, this is a map of the life expectancy in 2019. You can see that the developing countries have a much lower life expectancy than the developing countries. And so when we look at death rates, obviously we're going to look at disease, and we can really categorize disease in one of two groups, right? One is acute or epidemic disease. So a disease that appears rapidly in the population and affects a large percent of the population, and then will decline and almost disappear, and then can reappear later. Currently, we're looking at measles, which is crazy because there's a vaccine for it, but whatever. Another time. Of course, there's also chronic disease, which is always pregnant. So this is like heart disease, cancer, stroke, and so it occurs in a relatively small but constant basis in part of the population. So another case study that we're going to take a look at is AIDS in Africa. And so from 1981 to 2009, there were 27 million deaths due to AIDS, and it was mostly young adults. So you ended up with a loss of productive workers, you had a loss of individuals in their reproductive ages, and then you also had a very sharp drop in life expectancy. And so the international community was trying to reduce the spread of HIV through education and through healthcare, and also family planning through condoms, and providing financial assistance and volunteer work. So taking a look specifically at Botswana, what it was projected as their population in 2020 without AIDS is in yellow, as you can see, and it's a lot more stable of a population, although larger, but because those people from ages 15 to 49 in those reproductive years were actually the ones who were dying, you end up with this really awkward pyramid. And so as those people were getting older, and so in 2020, they're past their reproductive years, you have this very skinny portion on top, and then kind of a bulge out in the middle of the country in the reproductive ages. And so about 148,000 people died. So it was a massive epidemic in Botswana that just completely altered their population structure. Another reason why people have a lower life expectancy is because of unsafe water, poor sanitation, and poor hygiene. And again, right, it's my motto. People are dying from not having safe water to drink, and we're flushing our toilets with water that we could technically drink. And 1/10 of the global disease could be prevented if we just increase the access to clean water around the world, improve sanitation. So that means, really sewage and being able to draw it away from living quarters, and then improving hygiene. So just hand washing, right? Seems so basic, but 1 in 4 people in low-income countries don't have access to soap and water at home. And so you can reduce deaths from waterborne illness, which causes diarrhea, malnutrition, also drowning in recreational water bodies. Another reason why life expectancy is lower is because access to food is actually not very equal. A lot of the world is not food secure. And so what food security is that people have access to enough food to live a healthy, active life. And so when people are chronically hungry and malnourished, they get a weakened immune system, they get all kinds of illnesses, malaria, measles, diarrhea, respiratory illness, and it's not just around the world, actually. We have food deserts here in Stanford even, a food desert being somewhere where you don't have a full grocery store within walking distance, or if you don't have a car. And so there are hunger and food shortages around the world. And like I said, remember, it's not just around the world, also in our country. So how do we solve this problem that of this chronic hunger around the world? Well, we can promote economic development of developing countries without adequate food supplies. We can provide access to food and land resources to those who live in areas without them. So, like if you look at Africa here, there are actually technological ways that we can help the people who live there to show them maybe where would be a better place to grow their food through looking at quality of soil. So obviously the areas in red are not going to be good places to grow your food. So we could show this map to people and say, don't grow your food here, grow your food in those green areas. And so this kind of all brings us to this Malthusian theory. There's this dude Malthus who had a theory basically that Earth has a carrying capacity when it comes to humans. There's not going to be enough food. There's not going to be enough resources to support the world population. And so there's a lot of back and forth on this. I myself believe that we haven't actually reached our carrying capacity, even though there is all this chronic hunger. What I think is that there's actually a massive inequity of resources. So if we look at the developing countries and we look at the underdeveloped countries, the allocation of those resources is what's inequitable. And if there is a carrying capacity, I actually don't believe that we've reached it. And so, right, this is where we come into exponential growth. The human population was really, really low. And you can see that once the Industrial Revolution comes into play, and then medical advances, the human population takes off. So really, we've gained the majority of our population in the last 200 years, which is like a blink of an eye. And now, right, the world is over 7 billion. It's growing fast. And the majority of this growth is expected to happen in developing countries. So, like I said, human population is growing exponentially. So the larger the population, the faster it's going to grow. And why is this happening? Because there's an increase in average life expectancy, right? Better healthcare, better food, cleaner water, better sanitation. But like I said, the biggest increase in population are these developing nations. And so while the developing countries only have about 15% of the world's population, we control 80% of the world's wealth, where the low-income developing countries only control about 3% of the world's wealth. So, you know, it's crazy. The disparity is massive. So population growth is really happening because of these less developed countries. These more developed countries have negative or stable growth or slow growth, whereas developing countries really have a much more rapidly growing population. And so depending on, you know, what we can do to kind of slow this growth, it could go in a couple directions. It could keep on shooting upwards, it could stabilize and even out, or we could drop. And why do we even care about population? Is because, right, populations are impacting the environment. So the higher your population size, the more it's going to impact your environment. The more affluent people are, the more you affect your environment because you're using more and more resources. And the more technology you have, you're going to impact your environment more. And so the more people you have, again, right, you're going to produce more waste and thereby pollution. You're going to use more energy, more raw materials, use more land. So the more people there are, the more stress we're putting on our environment, which is why it's so important that we learn to live sustainably. So last but not least, we're going to talk about demographic transition, and basically a country is moving from underdeveloped to developed to a post-industrialized economy, and let's take a look at that. So I think that when we talk about demographic transition, this graph here is one of our best ways that we can really look at it. Our blue line being death rate, and our red line being birth rate, and the green line being the size of our population. So as a country begins, your birth and death rate are really pretty even, and you end up with a very, very slow population growth because your birth rate and death rate are even but high. And so you have a low, slow growth in population. As we move into our transitional stage 2, our death rate will drop because death rates tend to decline first. And the birth rate is actually staying high. And so because death rate is lower and birth rate is higher, we have this very rapid growth in population. As a country moves into the industrial or stage 3, the birth rate is also starting to drop. And so although not equal with the death rate, you have a much slower growth in population. And then finally in stage 4, you end up with birth rate becoming even with or dropping even below death rate. And so you have a stable / negative growth rate. So pre-industrial, transitional, industrial, post-industrial, stage 1, stage 2, 3, stage 4. And here it is bigger, right? Birth rate and death rate are even and high. Death rate falls, birth rate stays high, population grows. Stage 3, population grows slower because birth rate drops. And then stage 4 is the birth rate becoming even with or below death rate, where my population is becoming stable or decreasing. And here is yet another slide saying the same thing. So population is growing really slowly, and then the population grows rapidly due to improved health and food production. Then the population growth is slowing because of food production, health, education, and then finally population levels off and then starts to decline. And lastly, we have yet another explanation of the demographic stages. 1, 2, 3, 4. And thus concludes our very long PowerPoint of human populations.